Hey everyone, welcome back. Before we continue this afternoon's talks, we just wanted to have a quick mention for our Geology for Global Development fundraiser, which has currently raised over £240. So thank you to everyone for your kind donations.
Next up, we have Professor Christine Janis from the University of Bristol with her talk, The Evolution of Grassland Environments, What We Know from the Mammals That Inhabited Them.
Okay, let me try and share my screen. I'm sure it's going to work okay. There we go. Okay, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm going to talk about something rather different from the last talk. I'm not really a geologist at all. I'm interested in mammal evolution, but what I do does certainly relate to things that happen over deep time. So hopefully you'll find this interesting. Right, well, this one I'm showing you here is a picture of a very early grassland. So we didn't really have grasslands for quite a long, for much of Earth's history, and I'll go back over that in a second. But this one in North America, in the sort of central plains of North America, is one of the best known early grassland habitats, way before you see anything like that in Africa. At that time, these different species of horses were as common then as our different species of antelope in Africa today. And so, when we get to talking about the grassland habitats, this is sort of what I'm going to come back to, thinking about these ones that were at high latitude with horses rather than antelopes. But to put some perspective on this, of this idea of what was going on with grassland habitats, it's a very long-term view of sort of vegetation over the Phanerozoic. And you can see there've been very different times of different kinds of vegetation. And the flowering plants or the angiosperms, we don't really get them in the record until about 100 million years ago. So the modern kind of vegetation, the so-called xenophytic vegetation, is quite recent in the whole history of the Earth. And then grasses, which are of course angiosperms, are even more recent. And they are not first found until the end of the latest Cretaceous, so they actually first turn up in dinosaur coprolites. And then actual really grassland habitats don't come in until about 25 million years ago. So grasslands that are so familiar today, so well known today, they are in fact a very recent kind of habitat in Earth history as a whole. And these kinds of grasslands with lots of mammals in them that we're familiar with, like in the Serengeti, things like that, these were not known until about, until about 2.5 million years ago. So those are indeed very recent. So today, grasslands are very extensive, and they're found all across the globe. The temperate grasslands, like the prairie in North America, or the steppe in Asia, or the pampas in South America, those are treeless grasslands and not nearly as productive as the tropical grasslands, which also have trees and bushes in them, and they're called savannas. Now today, only Africa retains a large diversity of savanna mammals, and that's at least partly because of the megafaunal extinctions at the end of the Pleistocene. I do apologize for sounding so hoarse. Okay, so of course grasslands have a characteristic fauna as well as a characteristic flora with different kinds of animals there, and we can certainly see this difference in the fossil record. Right, so one of the things to think about is what's so great about grasslands as a habitat for animals. And when people think about grasslands, we're very biased by our sort of Western perception of grasses. This is sort of a nice English meadow where we see, cows and horses graze. And I think the largest crop in the sort of Western Hemisphere is lawn grass. But in fact, many grasslands are not that nice, and grass doesn't necessarily have to be nice, palatable stuff that animals like to eat. In fact, of course, bamboo is grass. So bear this in mind when thinking about what's going on with grassland evolution and grassland habitats and what the mammals are doing in response to these kind of changes in environments. Another point to make is that grasslands are really found in quite a limited array of temperature and precipitation. So what this shows us here is that these in blue here, these are where we find savannas in this array of temperature on the y-axis and precipitation on the x-axis. And so savannas, which are trees and grasses, things like prairies and pampas, they're found in a fairly narrow range of low precipitation and moderate to high temperature. Over here we have deserts, which are obviously low precipitation, and again, you can have cold deserts, but below a certain level, they turn to tundra. Or if you then add precipitation, these grassland habitats then turn to forest. So there's quite a narrow range. We think about how things like temperature and precipitation have changed over Earth's history. There are only certain points in time that are really conducive to the formation of grasslands. So this will get you an idea of, here we have a basic, East African counter-savanna habitat. If it gets drier, it'll turn to desert. If it gets wetter, it'll turn to tropical forest. If it gets colder and dry, it'll turn into more steppe-like conditions without trees. Right, so continue. So we're going to think about grassland evolution. Grasslands start coming in about here. I'm going to think about this in the context of overall temperature change during the Cenozoic. This is a famous curve from Zakos et al., 2001, and it's showing you, this is showing you temperatures above, well, in relation to present day average temperature. And this is actually surface pay temperatures from oxygen isotopes of marine foraminifera, but it gives you a comparative idea compared to what it's like today. So we had very warm temperatures in the start of the Cenozoic. They fell towards the end of the Eocene. We started getting glaciation at the poles around here. Then there's a bit of a rise again in the Miocene, and then they fall again down to the present day. And then of course, this is the Pleistocene, where it's colder than the present day. And we first start to see Northern Hemisphere glaciation. And also, particularly in the higher latitudes, you're getting evidence of decreasing precipitation in this time here. So remember that particularly for savannas, having lower levels of precipitation is important for their formation. Under higher levels of precipitation, you're going to get forests rather than grasslands. So we go back to think of our sort of bigger picture of what's going on. We're sort of, here we're singling out the world in the Eocene. And at about 50 million years ago, which you're about here on the paleotemperature curve, this shows you where the continents were at the time. And we had tropical forests way above their present confines. We had really nice lush forests, even within the confines of the Arctic Circle. There were no polar ice caps and no grasslands. This is the kind of habitats, vegetational habitats that were found then. So fast forwarding then to the Miocene, when you first see the grasslands appear, the tropical forests are now more confined to the equatorial regions. You've still got a warmer world in general than you have today. You've got forests here at higher latitudes than you have today, but you're getting ice cap at the poles, and you're seeing grasslands starting to spread across the higher latitudes, mainly in North America here and in Asia. So that's a background of where grasslands are in Earth's history. And I want to think now in particular about what's happening with the mammals and what we know about the mammals and how they're informing us about, because we can get data from paleobotany, but we can also get data from the mammals who inhabit the grasslands. And initially, these are our main source of data. This is quite an old picture, originally from D.G. Simpson, of sort of radiation of horses, which are initially mainly North American radiation. Horses here include things like asses and zebras today as well. And it's showing you that this is not very clear. These are meant to be a leaves for browsing, switching to grass for grazing. And it shows you the initial history of horses. They were all browsers, and then grazing horses started to appear in the sort of late end of the early Miocene. And this was the initial data we had back over 100 years ago. It was thought that this was then signaling a change in diet, and the horses must be signaling a change in the kind of flora. And how do we know the diet of fossil horses? Well, grazers have hypsilod or high crown cheek teeth. I'll come back and talk a bit more about this shortly. But the original idea was, well, this kind of, you see a change in the diet of the animals, that must mean that the flora has changed. So why don't we just use the fossil plant? Somehow I missed out macrofossils. The problem is plant macrofossils are rare, okay? Particularly in association with mammal faunas. You do get, obviously, a lot of plant fossils, but we very rarely get them in the same habitat as the animals that live there. And for many years, we really didn't have any good evidence from the plants about grasslands coming in. But we now are getting evidence from phytoliths. And phytoliths are microscopic particles of silica that are found inside plant cells. And different kinds of phytoliths are unique to different kinds of species. So these tell you about the kinds of plants that are there in the environment. And people started to look at the phytolith assemblages in North America over the same time period. And they saw that back in the Oligocene, we know we have these browsing horses. You've got phytoliths that are indicative of like shrubs and bushes and that kind of stuff. And then grass phytoliths start to come in, but they come in at way before the horses turn to grazing. They come in at the sort of the very end of the Oligocene, start of the Miocene. And this was then, and you don't really get evidence of decent, grasslands. Well, you have grasslands here, and you don't have evidence of the grazing horses until much later. And so that was then seen as a mismatch between the story from the plants and the story from the horses. So if the mammals don't agree with the plants, does that mean the mammals are wrong and we can't use mammals and we can't rely on looking at the diet of fossil mammals, or our ways of determining fossil diets are not sufficient? Or does it mean that the mammals maybe are still telling us something, even if it's not the traditional story that we thought they were telling us? So this brings us on to what's now been called ecometrics. So this has become quite a popular thing in the past decade or so, mainly from David Polly at the University of Indiana and his colleagues. And it's the idea that you can study functional traits of mammals at the level of communities. And these end up giving you information about the environment at both local scales and more continental scales. And if you think about how this works with the tooth crown height, here we have tooth crown height. And the reason why you need high crown teeth in grazers is because, well, grass and the process of eating grass is abrasive. And that wears down the teeth. And mammals, as you know from yourselves, only have a maximum of 2 sets of teeth. And once you've got your adult teeth, that's it. And so if you wear your teeth down, you're going to wear your teeth away before you can live to reproduce, basically. So the functional factor behind tooth crown height is dietary abrasion. I don't feel like I can see this. And then, in turn, what is causing abrasion? Well, it's both the vegetation quality, grass is fibrous, and also grit in the environment. It's not just grit, it's also eating soil. You eat grass, you can't help but ingest some soil going along with it. And then that in turn, so those direct environmental factors then lead you to indirect factors such as primary productivity, precipitation, maybe volcanics that are being deposited on the grass and making them more abrasive. So this idea is there are various traits that one can use, and hypsodonty is a classic one, that are giving you, at the level of the community, not just of the individual animals, information about the environment. And hopefully these traits are taxon-free. That is, that all grazers we know today have these hypsodont teeth. They're not entirely, I mean, horses tend to be more hypsodont than cows are, even though they're eating the same diet, but it's basically a common feature across grazing mammals. Okay, so the diets of herbivorous mammals within a community must relate to the available vegetation, and hence to the environmental factors, such as temperature and precipitation, that result in that particular vegetation habitat. And these just show us some pictures of some past habitats with browsing mammals, the middle Miocene woodland mammals. This is a weird beast known as a caligathea. It's actually related to horses and rhinos, but it had claws rather than hooves. And then the grazing, this is actually not a North American scene. Both these scenes are from Europe. And then the grazing mammals are a different community. So it's not just a different mammals, different kinds of mammals. It's also that they will have teeth that are reflective of different kinds of diets, and therefore of the different kinds of environments. And there are a number of, so as I said, the reason why we have, mammal tooth anatomy is so good for this is that mammals see their food up finally, so the action of the teeth is important for digestion, etc. They only have 2 sets of teeth, so the teeth must be durable to last a lifetime. And then what is causing dental abrasion? Well, it's things like grass phytoliths, windborne dust and grit, ingested soil. So hypsodonty can be used as a functional ecometric trait. So can various other aspects of tooth anatomy, such as the occlusal patterns, the patterns formed by the enamel on the tooth surface. Also the way the teeth get worn down can be used as a functional trait. But like I said, classically, hypsodonty has been used as the most important one. So hypsodont animals have these high crown teeth that then they erupt very high in the skull and jaw, and then they sort of wear down to the animal's lifetime, much as the lead in a mechanical pencil will wear down. Whereas brachydont animals like us, we have teeth that stop at the gum line. Once our teeth get worn down, they don't, that's it. And then, so browsers have brachydont teeth or low crown teeth. Grazers have hypsodont teeth or high crown teeth. In between, there are these mesodont forms that are sort of mixed feeders and browsers. And you make a hypsodonty index. It's a measure of the crown height versus some other linear measure, tooth length or tooth width, because obviously bigger animals have absolutely bigger teeth. So you want to have some measures independent of body size. And you're comparing here a roe deer as a browser with a horse as a grazer. You can see the teeth stop at the gum line here in the browser, but continue way up in the skull in a horse. You cannot make this animal eat grass for a living. It's going to wear its teeth down and die before it's old enough to reproduce. Hypsodonty has evolved convergently many times in mammals, and so it's not apparently not that hard to evolve. and there are not many constraints to evolving it, although it does require some modification of the skull and jaw. You can see here the orbit here over the teeth, so the orbit's way up here. So you do have to do some changes in the skull, but it doesn't seem to be a huge constraint to animals. It seems to have evolved convergently many times in mammals. And we can look at how hypsodonty varies with diet in modern mammals, and we can see it varies with both diet and habitat. So here we have, okay, what we're doing here is we're showing an array of animals of different feeding types. Grazer, mixed feeder, mainly grass, mixed feeder, mainly browse and browser, and how they stack up in 4 different habitats: in prairie or steppe, that's very open grassland, in savanna, in woodland, and in forest. Now, obviously there are no grazers in the woodland and forest, and no browsers in the prairie, but there are browsers in the savanna, like giraffe, for example. And we're looking at the average hypsodonty index of the animals that are found in those habitats. And what's interesting is not only does average hypsodonty increase going from forest to prairie, but even compare the grazers, say, in the savanna versus the prairie, they're more hypsodont in the more open habitats. So there's a sort of signal here. And even the browsers are more hypsodont in the savanna than they are in the woodland. So there's sort of a signal here of both diet and habitat. And it's because what wears your teeth away isn't just the food, but things like dust and grit and soil and things like that. And then what we can do is actually see whether we can quantify some sort of determinate way of looking at this in modern animals that could be then used to put back in the fossil record. So let me try and explain what's going on here. Each of these little circles we put, that's a point of a particular modern community. Say this one here in blue could be the Serengeti. This could be, I don't know, the Zaire forest, something like that. 4 different habitats: desert, savanna, temperate forest, tropical forest. Along here is the percentage mean hypsodonty, which is for any given community, it's a mean level of hypsodonty divided by the number of species over a certain size. And so along here we have things that are more hypsodont, here that are less hypsodont. And if you plot this against precipitation, you can see you get a fairly good relationship. So you can actually use this now. You can use the hypsodonty, the community level hypsodonty from the extant animals to then take this back in the fossil record, at least going back to what, to mammals. You couldn't do it with dinosaurs, but going back to sort of more recent mammal communities and sort of say, okay, so can we use hypsodonty then to tell us about precipitation? Because as you remember, it's a level of precipitation as well as temperature that is really determining whether or not you have a grassland present. And this is comparing what we see in Africa today. Again, remember that Africa is the only place where we still have a decent megafauna of mammals left. These colors are not actually identical. They're not showing quite the same thing. They're showing comparable things between maps, and they're calibrated to each map, not between them. But this is a map showing you the annual mean precipitation in Africa today. And this is a map showing hypsodonty. And it's showing you that you have hypsodonty where you have deserts and where you have savannas, but obviously not where you have tropical forests. So there's a pretty good correlation here between, pretty good correlation between the levels of hypsodonty and the levels of precipitation in faunas today, in communities of mammals today. Obviously, it breaks down for places where you don't have ungulates, like in Madagascar, you have these lemurs, so it isn't going to work there. But comparing places where you have the hoof mammals, where you have the big herbivores, it picks up the levels of precipitation quite well. So then what you can do is to go back into the fossil record and say, okay, so using this, can we then look at fossil communities? And can we then try and determine what is happening in terms of precipitation? So this is giving you actually using levels of hypsilonity now to predict the rainfall. So this is showing you the predicted rainfall in various different mammal communities from the herbivores, from the large herbivores. And you can see, well, first going along time, going from the Miocene here through to the Pliocene, going through time, it's basically going from more blue to more orange and red. So it's getting drier over time. And we know that's true from other estimates of precipitation, like as we know from the plants themselves, and we have good plant fossils. But it is showing that the herbivores, the mammals in the community, can actually be used as a way of calibrating, so ecometrics of calibration of the levels of rainfall. And the other thing to note here is that although you have a few red and other things going on in Eurasia, in fact, aridity in North America is preceding that in the old world, in Eurasia. So it's all red and yellow here, whereas only a few red and yellow here. And it's not really until the present day when Eurasia catches up, and even so, it's somewhat more mesoc in Eurasia than it is in North America. So this is sort of picking up on the idea you have these grasslands habitats with these grazing horses evolving in North America before you saw similar kinds of environments and similar habitats in Eurasia. And it's showing you how the mammals themselves can actually be determinants of different things that were happening in the environment in past times. So here's a little picture to try and compare what's going on in the early late Miocene, like between 10 and 12 million years ago, compared in North America and Eurasia. So there's our, and we know there are obviously other aspects of the mammals we can use to tell what kind of habitat they're in, how long their legs are, that kind of things. But I mean, just from the heat study alone, we can see that in this habitat, we have a much drier environment with a bigger diversity of grazers, reflecting the grasslands that we know, so they're from the phytoliths, whereas in Europe, it's much more mesoc, much more of a sort of woodland savanna, not a more kind of dry open savanna like you had in North America. Pay attention to this little purple arrow. This little guy is going to be important in a second. So back to the original question, what are the mammals telling us? So we said we had a mismatch. We had this mismatch between now the plants are telling us that grasslands come in here. The animals don't turn to grazing until here. Have we just got something wrong here? And does Ecometrics, this is a way of using hypsilonity as an index of things like precipitation, inform us about what was really going on? So it's certainly true that the grasslands are coming in, and it's still moderately dry here. It doesn't get a lot drier till about here. Certainly it's drier later as you go through time, but you've definitely got a grassland kind of habitat here, as you can tell from the phytoliths. So what are the mammals telling us? Other interesting things are going on here as well. For example, this period here is going to the mid-Miocene climatic optimum. And you see both an increase in temperature here and an increase in CO2. The two being, of course, related, but the horses become hypsilon at this time, at this mid-Miocene climatic optimum, where you've got this increase in temperature, increase in CO2. Could the higher CO2 and temperature be anything to do with why horses are now switching to a diet of grass, whereas previously they really weren't eating much in the way of grass? Higher CO2 means that the plants perceive the environment as being less arid, and so you get higher levels of plant productivity. I'll just try and explain that a little bit. Lower levels of carbon dioxide mimic the effects of aridity, while higher levels mimic the effect of greater amount of rainfall. It's because plants use these stomata, or holes in the leaves, to let in both water and oxygen, and they let in carbon dioxide and let out water and oxygen. So when the carbon dioxide levels are lower, they need to have these stomata open for longer in order to get enough carbon dioxide per day. So, but those open stomata then let the water escape. So, so basically the plants perceive the environment as being more arid when there's lower levels of carbon dioxide, whether or not it is. So that's part of the reason why plant productivity is actually higher in higher levels of carbon dioxide. I mean, it's not that simple, it's all kinds of things going on here, but it does make me wonder, is there could be something happening here with this higher level of CO2? Could something be happening to plant palatability? Could the plants suddenly becoming nicer to eat? Are horses ignoring the grasses here because they don't like them? At this point, something's happened and the grasses become more palatable. And then, of course, they're stuck being grazers, so they carry on being grazers, even though carbon dioxide declines after that. Now, what's interesting is that's what's going on with the horses. But recently, people have been looking at the small mammals, at the rodents and rabbits, and they tell a different story. Now, this is a bit of a complex diagram. What it's showing is in the same time period, the levels of hypsodonty in rodents and rabbits in North America. And this sort of brown, the colors are all the same, aren't they? These sort of more purpley colors, those show brachiodont rodents. The orange and the yellow and the dark brown show progressive levels of hypsodonty. And you can see that even though there are some hypsodont rodents back here, their hypsodonty really takes off right when we know from the phytoliths the grasslands come in. So they are actually, at that point, becoming animals that are more eating the grass. Why would they be doing it and not the horses? In some ways, it may be because they're less mobile. They are more stuck in their local habitats. They haven't got a choice. They can't up and go 50, 100 miles to somewhere else where the food's nicer. Also, larger animals can also migrate seasonally, and they can store up more fat reserves to see out periods with less available food. So there are all kinds of reasons why, horses may have been able to avoid eating grasses, whereas rodents and rabbits are sort of stuck having to eat them in this time period here. Still doesn't quite explain, though, why they switched at this point here. And I want to draw your attention to a part of horse evolution that no one ever looks at, and it's these guys over here. These are large browsing horses, that some of them as big as modern day cart horses, that are also found in the same habitats. They actually get over to Eurasia before the grazing horses do. And they also undergo a profound radiation at the same time the grazing horses do. So it's like, well, that's interesting. These animals, and what is happening? And I'm going to tell you, I actually don't know. This is something I'm hoping somebody will investigate. But I think part of the issue here is when we look at evolution, we tend to look at the winners and not the animals we perceive as losers because they went extinct. Now, after this sort of rise in temperature and carbon dioxide here, they both fell again, and all kinds of larger browsers went extinct all over the world. So it wasn't just these horses that bit the dust, as it were. But it's not just grazers who are diversifying here, it's these big browsers. They aren't as common as the grazers, but that's because browsers never are. Think of Africa today. You've got a whole bunch of wildebeest and only a few kudu. But if it wasn't a nice, lush, treed savanna, you wouldn't have any kudu. The kudu being there is telling you something about the habitat. And these are like kudu in that sense. But why it takes until then for both the grazing horses and the big browsers to both take off, I actually don't know. But I do think it's a signal that needs to be investigated. So that's it. That's what I have to say, and hopefully that was amusing to people. And I'll take some questions if there are any.
So thank you, Christine, for that really interesting talk, and thank you for joining us as well. We do have a couple of questions on the Discord for you.
Okay.
Let's get that up. It says, to what extent do you think the differential responses towards complex fire-climate interactions have ultimately yielded or else driven the biotic and abiotic diversifications in terms of the interspecific variations of the herbivore grassland systems since the end of the Oligocene epoch? Oligocene, yeah.
Okay, that was so. Can you repeat that? That was quite complex.
It's a big question, yeah. To what extent do you think the differential responses towards complex fire-climate interactions have ultimately yielded or else driven the biotic and abiotic diversification in terms of the interspecific variations of the herbivore grassland system since the end of the Oligocene epoch?
Well, obviously, changes in climate and environment have resulted in changes in grassland habitats. I was more interested in the inception of the grassland. I mean, this was more about the origin of the grasslands, in particular this particular grassland in North America, which was the main, one of the first, earliest, main grassland habitats. So obviously, I think that environmental factors are driving it. How much then do the interactions between the mammals themselves drive it? That's hard to know. I think it's more, I suspect it's more abiotic things that are driving things independently rather than particular interactions between the herbivores. I don't know whether that answers the question.
We have another one. Is it possible that supervolcano eruptions, i.e. Paleo Yellowstone, might have forced the horses to eat the grass?
I think volcanic eruptions make it harder to eat the grass because you have volcanic dust falling on the grass and it becomes really horrible and abrasive to eat. So I think that, and I don't, we can see, funnily enough, in South America, there's very good correlation between episodes of volcanic eruption and when mammals become hypsodont. And that actually happens before the grasslands come there. And everyone always used to think that meant that grasslands were emerging earlier in South America than they were in North America. But we now know that isn't true. And the mammals there, these sort of weird endemic mammals that are now extinct, ungulates, they got very hypsodont very early, but that's been correlated with periods of intense volcanic activity that seems to have made everything that they wanted to eat horribly gritty and abrasive. I don't think there's a particularly good correlation. Obviously, there have been episodes of volcanism in North America, but I've not seen anybody make any particular correlation of particular episodes with transitions to being hypsodont.
Okay, we have another question from the Discord as well. It says, "Hi Christine, great talk. I was wondering whether your research could be applied to other climate change events and what difference would be between rapid climate change events compared to some slower changes."
Well, my research right now is more on locomotion in animals rather than the paleo. I got particularly interested in this whole thing about what increasing levels of CO2 were doing for increased levels of productivity. And I think that was something, the increased CO2 was something that was sort of, was popular for a while, then verboten for a while, now it's popular again. So I think that's been a big influence over time on things like plant productivity and also on things like levels of carbon versus nitrogen in plants, which actually favors, in fact, higher CO2 makes plants more productive but less nutritious, and actually favors horses over ruminants, let's say. So I mean, so I think short-term things, so I think the very long-term evolutionary trends we see are driven by long-term events. Shorter-term things like fluctuations, when we know we can track them, we can't really track, we start to be able to track shorter-term fluctuations, many during the Pleistocene. And with many of those things, what you can see is animals migrate in and out. So you can have a short-term fluctuation and animals will change where they're living. but it won't necessarily cause evolutionary change unless they're stuck on an island or something and can't get out of there. Of course, part of the problem in North America is it is an island continent for so long. And a lot of things can't, particularly why you get the extinction of primates in North America at the end of the Eocene, is they cannot migrate down to South America because there's no connection. So, so I think that, but we don't know so much about the short-term changes until we start getting the records of the Pliocene and Pleistocene. Does that answer the question? I'm not sure.
Yeah, there's one that's just come in the Zoom chat. It says small animals have shorter lifespans and can be more selective in their eating choice. Might this explain their adaptation to grasslands before horses?
Yes, I mean, I think it's easier. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. But I don't think the lifespan is such a thing. Yeah, they have higher rates of reproduction, so that's why they can have. That's why they can have shorter lifespans, but they still become hypsodont. They still have to stop their teeth from wearing away. I think that would more explain why they wouldn't have to become a hypsodont. Whereas in fact, many of these rodents actually get teeth up that are ever growing. They can be more selective. You're absolutely right. They can eat the seeds and the nice younger leaves in preference to the older leaves. So that's probably an important thing too. Yes, I mean, I'm not so interested in explaining why smaller mammals did it first. I think there are fairly good reasons for that, and you've made some very good points there. But I still wonder, why does this take so long? Everyone said, oh, there was an evolutionary lag. Oh, don't be silly. It didn't take 5 million years to learn to eat grass. Come on. I mean, they could do it if they wanted to. It doesn't take that long to become hypsodont. I don't think that lifespan, is going to give you a lag of difference. Is going to give you a lag of 5 million years. And like I said, it's not just the grazing horses that are doing something, then it's these big browsers. And that's really weird. I mean, no one what I'm going to do, I'm not somebody who does all these sort of modern algorithms with phylogenes and stuff, but I'm going to try and persuade some of my younger colleagues who are up to date with all these, new algorithms to actually go and try and model some of this stuff and try and see what's going on there. I don't know whether we'll ever get the problem with doing that is I'm not sure you'll ever know why. But at least if you've got a question, you can go and look for an answer. If you've got some data that say, there's a problem here, guys, let's go and think about it, rather than just say, oh, well, evolutionary lag. No, I don't like that. I think that's a bit daft.
Okay, we've got another question come through the Zoom chat as well. And it says, is there no pollen available in the fossil record to tell us what plants are there for food?
The pollen records don't go, as far as I know, and I'm not a paleobotanist, but as far as I know, pollen records are mainly, again, things you find in Pleistocene lake deposits. And they aren't good back then, no. I mean, that's why looking at the phytoliths was such a breakthrough. And that really was a breakthrough. People I know who work on pollen work in the Pleistocene. I'm not saying there's no fossil pollen before then, but it's not commonly used before then.
We have time just for one more question. We'll do it from the Zoom. In determining the evolution patterns of the grasslands and the econometric traits of the herbivores, is it likely that human influences have played an important role in this, especially because we could be now in the Anthropocene epoch?
Well, obviously, human activities are going to play a very large role in what happens in the future, and probably what happened, in the past few 100,000 years. But I mean, again, that's not the question I'm asking. I'm looking back at what was happening back in the Miocene. So, yeah, if humans are changing the habitat, then obviously the animals are going to have to, adapt, migrate, or die. But the idea is that these ecometric indicators are telling you something about what's actually there in terms of environmental conditions, rather than humans might alter the conditions, at which point you might then see a change over time in what the animals are telling you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for joining us again.